The detective knocked 3 times, sharp, deliberate, the sound of a stranger who has learned the grammar of houses. I stood by the peephole, the old wood of the door warm under my palm, and watched his shadow fall away from the porch light. He held up his badge like a small, cold promise. For a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming, if grief had finally made the world ridiculous. Then he said my name. They called me Helpless. They said it in the tone people use when they pity a widow, softly, with the faint shake of a head that means poor thing. I had been vulnerable. No one should pretend otherwise. I had been walking through my days with an ache so large it rearranged the rooms in my head. But helpless? No, not for long. Not after I stopped pretending the small things were accidents. If this story is one you need to hear, stay with me. There are things to learn in the ordinary details, how a stranger hides in small courtesies, how paperwork becomes a weapon. If this reaches someone caring for an older parent or neighbor, please subscribe so more stories like this can be told and heard. The house sits on a quiet street just outside a Colorado town, where the mountains lean close enough that you can feel their shadow at dusk. George loved that view. He used to stand at the kitchen window with his coffee and watch the light move across the pines. He taught me how to prune the roses so they always turned out in a certain stubborn way. When he died, sudden, a single night that rearranged everything, my world narrowed down to the scent of his shirts, a stack of unread letters, and the hollow ritual of moving through rooms that still expected to. My son David married Melissa 3 years after George's funeral. At first, she seemed to arrive like a small, tidy bomb. She brought cookies, real ones, the kind with butter and salt that melt on the tongue. She called to check on me, politely, at reasonable hours. She asked if I wanted company on Sundays. People used those first weeks and months to build trust. Grief makes you hospitable to help. I admit I was glad for her laughter at the table, for the way she made the garden look less abandoned. She knew the right things to say when I spoke of George in the present tense, and she listened without trying to fix the past. That part, her kindness, felt true. So when the questions started, they were small enough to be dismissed. "Do you have a will?" she'd ask, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Have you thought about your financials?" Sometimes it's easier if someone helps with the accounts. She never said it with malice, she said it as a favor. People forget the most effective predators often begin as helpers. They practice the voice of concern until it becomes indistinguishable from care. At dinner one night, she slid a slim folder across the table as if it were a family recipe. The folder had neat typed pages, forms, blanks that suggested the kind of authority you sign when you imagine dying years from now, not in the small, ordinary way that death sometimes enters. Inside were papers that named a power of attorney and an affidavit, and spaces for signatures. I refused, politely. I told her I didn't want to sign anything that night, that I needed time. David looked awkward and half smiled as if to say, "It's fine," but his hand hovered over his fork longer than usual. Melissa said softly, "Later then, Mama, when you're ready." Later, in those months, became pressure without the word. The questions multiplied in casual conversations. "Have you thought about giving someone access to pay your bills? You shouldn't have to worry about that." It was always framed as freedom for me, so you can rest. But surrender dressed in kindness is still surrender. Before long, the little intrusions didn't look small anymore. Things moved in my house. A letter misplaced, a ledger left open, a drawer that hadn't been touched in years showing a curl where a paper had been lifted. At first I blamed my forgetfulness. Grief comes with cobwebs across the mind. Then I began to notice patterns. Minutes removed from bank statements, a check missing its stub, a small cash withdrawal that made no sense. They were the kind of details friends brush off as clerical errors, but together they spelled a pattern that made my heart small and hard. One afternoon, I went to the study for a particular file, George's old insurance paperwork, and the room felt off before I opened the door. The faint smell of something sweet, like the cookies that had once been a comfort, lingered near the bookcase. A cushion was moved. Papers on the desk were slightly askew. I remember the metallic tang in my mouth as if the house had shifted on an axis. On the corner of the desk, underneath a blotter that should have been flush with the wood, someone had left a single envelope with a folded piece of paper inside. It looked like a bill at first glance, but the signature at the bottom, my name, made the ink snag in my chest. It wasn't the smooth, trailing hand of my usual scrawl. It slanted differently, the letters in Catherine cramped where mine are always loose and looping. I held it up to the light and could feel my hands go cold. The signature was a forgery. It might have been a single document to some, but to me it was an intrusion that turned everything intimate and private into material for another's use. I do not say this lightly. Finding that paper was like finding a betrayal laid out on the kitchen table. The hole opened again where grief had been sutured. My first thought was not only, who would do this, but are there more? I started to make a list. I wrote it in a small leather journal I kept for grocery lists and doctor appointments. Now I used it like a ledger of suspicion. Date, found paper and study. Date, missing deposit stub.
Date, check, written out to X with no explanation. I taped copies of bank statements to the inside cover and wrote notes with times and names. Patricia, my friend from the bridge club, noticed my handwriting next to the list when she came over for tea and asked if I was all right. I showed her one of the pages, because sometimes outward shame gets smaller when another person holds it. "That's awful," she said, and she crumpled the paper as if that might crush the wrong into nothing. Then she did something else. I think she was as practical as she was tender. She suggested I see a lawyer her cousin had used, a man named Marcus Chen who handled elder law. "Don't wait," she said. "You don't have to be brave alone. There's no shame in asking for help with paperwork, but there is in letting it go unattended." If I had known then how central the word power would become, power of attorney, power to take, power to assume a life for another, I would have paid closer attention when Melissa first mentioned it. But grief makes one sleepy. The world hums on as if the absent person were only in another room. People leaned toward me to offer ease, and I mistook the reach for support. Marcus came recommended, and he came with a gentle directness that I appreciated. He sat at my kitchen table and unfolded his briefcase like a man unpacking a map. He listened to the pattern I described, the missing amounts, the moved papers, the envelope with the sloppy signature. He nodded as if the pieces fit a picture he had seen before. "Power of attorney," he said when I asked, as if the phrase itself were a kind of geography we could chart together. He explained it plainly. It's a legal document that gives another person the authority to make decisions for you, about money, about property. There are versions. Some let someone pay bills, some let someone make medical choices if you cannot. It's commonly used for convenience, Marcus said. It's not evil by itself, but it's also the document people use when they want control without consent. He showed me examples of legitimate forms and of forged ones. We compared my signature to the suspicious one that had been left in the study. He leaned over with a small magnifying glass and pointed at the pressure points, the way the ink thickened where a genuine hand would slow. "A forger will sometimes overcompensate," he said, pressing harder here to imitate a curve. "The tremor gives it away." I had to laugh. Some secret skill of mine, my shaky dinners with a pen, revealed to an expert. The laugh was like a breaking twig. Marcus recommended steps. Change the locks, contact the bank, gather everything in one place. But he did not say, sue them. He spoke of protection first, the practical act of limiting access. He used the word evidence often and not casually. He treated a ledger like a language that, once read properly, could speak for itself.
That evening, after he left, I went back to the study and took out every piece of paper. I made copies, labeled them, and numbered them like exhibits for someone I could not yet imagine would stand with me. I installed a small exterior camera, nothing elaborate, a simple device Patricia helped me mount under the eave, so it pointed at the door and the path to the garage. It felt odd, setting a camera on my home the way one might set a jar under a fly trap. It felt necessary. Days turned into a pattern of watching and waiting. Melissa's presence changed like sun seen through clouds. She kept doing the small things that make one trust. She brought coffee, apologized for taking the trash out without asking, little disarming acts. But there were other signs. She began to offer to take over check writing, suggesting she could help keep things organized. When I said I could manage, she would say with a smile, "You shouldn't have to worry, Mom. Let me take that off your hands." There was a condescension in it I had noticed before I could name it. One morning, the phone rang with a voice I did not know. Warm, professional, a bank manager named Mr. Rodriguez. He asked to speak with Catherine Patterson. His tone was careful. He said, "We have a situation we think you should be aware of." There are moments when a single sentence can make the room tilt, and this was one. He told me that someone had presented paperwork at the bank that named them as my power of attorney, and that the signature looked like mine.
He said they'd flagged it and were holding any transactions until we clarified. He asked if I had authorized anyone. I could feel the inside of my throat tighten like a fist. "Who did you suspect?" I asked, and the answer was not something he could put on the phone. "We are investigating," he said, "but because of your safety and privacy, we'd advise you to come in with someone you trust." When Mr. Rodriguez called, everything accelerated in a way that felt both terrifying and relieving. Terrifying because the evidence was material and immediate. Relieving because one of the places I had trusted, my bank, had noticed and acted. It meant the pattern I had been stringing together in my journal was not a paranoia of an old woman losing her grip. It meant someone else saw the irregularity too. Marcus helped me plan the next steps, not like a showdown, but like a carefully choreographed meeting. He said we needed to document everything, to create an unbroken chain from the bank's alert, to the paper in my study, to the footage from the camera. He explained simply that banks keep records, who presented papers, at what time, and what copies they make. He explained that forging a power of attorney, putting your name where it is not, is a crime called forgery, and that using another person's identity to access funds can be called identity theft. These terms can sound abstract until they are in the middle of your life.
"I won't promise outcomes," Marcus said, which I appreciated. Lawyers often hedge, and his restraint felt honest. "But we can build a case based on the evidence the bank has and the documents you found." He told me what to expect, not what to hope. A slow, methodical process of review. An investigator coming to ask questions. Potential criminal referral if the evidence points that way. He gave me a list of what to bring to the bank. The books, copies of checks, my journal entries. Things that matter more than feelings in the eyes of the law. People ask me sometimes why I didn't confront Melissa then, why I didn't stand up and shout. I learned there are two ways to be brave. One is loud, immediate, the kind of courage people film for their feeds. The other is quiet and prepared, assembling witnesses, creating records, letting the evidence do the speaking. Confrontation without a plan would have been only emotion against a practiced performance. I wanted results, not scenes. So we organized. Marcus called Patricia and arranged a time when she could be present. I gave a copy of my journal to the bank manager, Mr. Rodriguez, who kept his voice measured, that said that the bank would hold requests and notify law enforcement if necessary. He also mentioned that a bank rarely lifts such a hold unless there is a clear legal authorization. That line, clear legal authorization, was the hinge we intended to use. The camera did its work in a way that surprised me. At first, I kept checking the feed, the way one checks the oven to see if the cake is burning. But the more I watched, the more ordinary things looked coded. Who came to the door, what time, whether someone lingered by the mailbox. I learned to read the times as if they were syllables in a sentence. When Melissa arrived that week to drop off a casserole, the camera showed her pause by the gate, glance at the porch light, and walk to the door with the practiced ease of someone who had been there often. Watching the footage made me see how close she had been, how naturally she crossed into the private parts of our life. We gathered copies of bank records and stacked them like a testament. Photographs of the study were taken from every angle. The blotter lifted, the envelope found, the drawer slightly ajar. I took a photograph of the forged signature next to one of my genuine ones. The contrast on the paper made the differences ugly and obvious. My handwriting tremors were my own, real and small. The forgery tried to be me and failed in all the ways a pretender does. The weeks that followed felt like being in a fogged hallway where every door leads to the same room. Melissa continued to step in and out of my life like a weather pattern. David, my son, wavered. Sometimes he would stand beside me with a protective edge in his voice, and other times he would deflect, as if pleading not to see too closely at his household.
He loved me, and he loved his wife. His loyalty pulled in different directions, and I could see the pain that created in him. I guarded my words when I spoke to him because I did not want to appoint him the role of enemy by default. He needed space to see and evidence to understand. At night, I would sit at the kitchen table with George's old radio playing faintly and write more in the journal. I would list dates and small amounts, each entry a pebble in the shoe that made me limber enough to move. The practical motions, photocopies, labels, calls to the bank, were the stitches that kept my fear from unraveling. They were also the armor I was learning to wear. One gray morning, Mr. Rodriguez called again. "We have someone requesting access," he said. The voice in the phone was careful, but there was a gravity I couldn't miss. Marcus told me to remain calm and to let the bank take its time. He arranged to be present for the meeting if I wanted him there. He said nothing about arrest or courtroom. He spoke of documentation, of preserving the integrity of the timeline. That legal language, quiet and procedural, became my anchor. We sat across from each other in my kitchen, Marcus with his briefcase closed, Patricia with her bag on the chair beside her, and waited like people in a church vestibule before a service. "If they try to present anything," Marcus said quietly, "we will ask for an ID for proof, and if the signature differs from your samples, we will ask the bank to make a copy and notify law enforcement." He explained that recording things without permission can be complicated legally, so we would rely on the bank's official record and the camera footage and the documents we had prepared. He was careful to urge legality in every action, because the last thing a victim needs is to be accused of impropriety herself. When Melissa arrived, the camera caught the smallness of her entrance, a soft knock, a smile that could have been practiced, a casserole dish clutched like an offering. She spoke to Patricia as if they were old friends, asked about my roses, and then turned to me with a kind of bright concern. "I just thought I'd check on you," she said. "You looked tired the other day." The voice that had soothed my grief now felt like a mask in a play. I kept my face steady. The camera had recorded everything, and the bank had the copies. We were no longer alone. The house felt less like a place where things could be taken, and more like a courthouse of everyday life. The power in that shift is subtle. It isn't revenge. It is protection. It is deciding that the story of the house would be told by evidence and not by gossip. That day after Melissa left, I sat down and wrote another entry. The list is a strange comfort, numbers and dates that act as both map and proof. I thought about the word helpless again, and how often society uses it as a gentle dismissal.
My neighbors who had called me that thought they were kind. They imagined grief as a long season when a widow steps out of the arena. But grief doesn't make one ignorant. It makes one human, and human beings can be clear-eyed when they choose to look. There are ordinary moments in the weeks after discovery. The mailman greeting me by name, the barista at the coffee shop nodding in recognition, Patricia bringing a fresh loaf of bread that felt like a true gift. There are also nights I lay awake imagining worst-case scenarios, counting money with my eyes closed, thinking in ledger entries. One learns to live with two calendars, the calendar of life and the calendar of vigilance. We had assembled a pile of things that added up to a story: the paper with the forged signature, the camera footage of Melissa at the door, the bank's alert and hold, my journal with dates and amounts, and photographs of disturbed papers. They were not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but in court and in investigation, small, consistent facts are the currency of truth. Marcus called one afternoon with news that made the blood leave my face and then return with a strange steadiness. "They've requested copies of the documents," he said. "The bank is cooperating. They are reviewing the surveillance and the paperwork." He did not use the word arrest, and I wasn't ready for that word anyway. The next steps would be an investigator's interview, perhaps a referral to the district attorney, perhaps nothing. He reminded me again that nothing is certain. "But you've done the right thing," he said. "You've preserved the record." There was one more thing Marcus said that has stayed with me. He spoke not as a lawyer, but as someone who had seen 100 similar old women who were anything but helpless. "Often," he said, "this begins with small acts and escalates. Don't ignore small things because they mean insignificant." He told me to keep documenting, to let the bank and the law do their parts, to lean on Patricia and keep the calendar of people who came and went. I thought of George and how he would have handled the situation: practical, direct, prone to solve rather than to fret. That was a comfort. It made me feel less like a person undone and more like someone carrying on with intention. The waiting is what builds the tension. It is a peculiar kind of grinding clarity, where every knock at the door might be an omen, and every ordinary person a possible witness. I would spend mornings checking the camera feed, afternoons on the phone with Marcus, and evenings writing more notes. There is a discipline to it. And through it all, I noticed a shift in the way people spoke to me. The tone of pity softened into a tone of respect. David began to sit longer across from me at the table, to ask me about documents, not in passing, but with interest. He would sit by the window and look at the mountains, as if trying to see which version of reality had the better view.
One afternoon, as late winter leaned toward an early Colorado spring, and the air had that thin, sharp quality that makes your lungs feel clearer, I stood at the porch and watched the road. The camera was aimed at the gate, and the world felt like a connected set of small actions and careful responses. I had done what I thought was necessary. Notice had been given, documents gathered, an attorney hired, the bank informed. The house felt taut with potential outcomes. We were ready to move from the slow work of gathering to the next phase, but vulnerability has taught me to hold the future's details lightly. There is power in preparedness and in letting the right people, police, bankers, and lawyers, step into the parts of the story that require authority. I had learned to name what had happened without letting it name me. That distinction is crucial. The days after the bank's alert blurred into each other, and then one morning the phone rang with a different urgency. A detective wanted to talk. He introduced himself as Detective Morrison and asked to come by. My heart leaped in a way I had not expected. The sound of his name on the other end of the line had something official and raw about it. A new stage, perhaps, or the beginning of another kind of resolution. I made tea. I cleared the kitchen table of extra papers. Marcus said he'd prefer to be there. Patricia offered to drive me to the bank. David called and left a message asking if he could stop by. The house, which had once been a museum of old habits, now hummed with preparation. The camera was pointed. The journals were stacked. The copies were ready. The evidence sat like a row of small, brave things waiting to be read. I opened the journal and began to write another entry. I wrote down the detective's name, the time he would arrive, and the mild details that make up the scaffolding of the next act. I wrote that I no longer accepted helpless as a diagnosis. I wrote that being older did not mean being without recourse. Then I closed the book, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window to watch the spring light change the angle of the shadows on the porch. There is a peculiar calm that comes right before you knock on a door, when you know the conversation inside will shape the rest of your life. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. I thought of the forged signature, how someone had tried to write my life for me on a small slip of paper, and of the camera, which had watched and recorded and refused to let small actions vanish into plausible deniability. I felt for the first time in months like the person who could answer. When Detective Morrison finally arrived, he walked up the path with the gait of someone who had been taught to respect a house. He did not flash his badge theatrically. He showed it when we asked and then placed it away. His eyes were practical, the look of a person who had been given thin threads of truth to unravel. "Mrs.
Patterson," he said, and there it was, my name in his mouth, like an object of attention, not pity. "Thank you for meeting with me." We sat at the kitchen table like an odd committee. Marcus took the lead with the documents. Patricia sat on my side of the table like a steady hand. David texted that he would be late. Detective Morrison asked questions in a measured tone. Times, names, the sequence of events. Each question a sentence that folded the past into a present I was learning to inhabit. I answered. I told him about the dinner with the folder, the misplaced papers, the forged signature. I handed him copies of my journal and the bank's correspondence. He read, and when he paused at the photograph of the signature, his face did not change, but I felt something pass through the room like an invisible acknowledgement. He asked about the camera footage and whether we had copies, and Marcus provided them on a small drive. There was an efficiency in his movements, an absence of flourish, and a kindness in the way he said, "We'll take it from here." I think for a moment, one quiet breath, I allowed myself to be surprised by relief. The detective's presence did not erase the hurt or the betrayal. It did not fix what had been stolen, and it could not restore the private sense of trust that had been breached, but it meant that the story would be told to people with authority to do something about it. When he left, he promised to follow up and to keep us informed. The porch seemed to release a little air after he stepped onto it and walked away. The world, which had been a tight knot, began to relax in ways that felt small and enormous at once. I made more tea, and David came by that evening. We sat and spoke without turning the subject into an argument. He apologized in the awkward way sons do, the way people try to bridge distance with words that don't quite reach the floor. He told me he believed me. That too mattered. What I did not know then, could not possibly know, was how much more there was to uncover. The forged signature had been only the beginning, a single signpost pointing to a larger path. The camera would give us something else. The bank would send a file thicker than I'd expected. There would be other documents and small transactions and patterns that had been hidden under the ease of family life. For now, though, I lived in the thrum after a knock, the knowledge that someone had heard me and had come to the door. The house felt less like a place that could be taken, and more like a place I could guard with the help of others. I had called my lawyer. People had noticed. The word helpless no longer fit. What came next would require patience, courage, and the steady work of translation, turning small thefts and slippery signatures into a clear account. I put my hand on the journal. The entry for the day was a simple sentence. Evidence gathered. Authorities notified. The rest of the story was not yet finished, but the ground beneath my feet felt different. I had learned to listen for small things, to trust oddities, and to let the law be a partner rather than an enemy. In the glimpse of late afternoon light on the maple trees outside, I felt a cautious, careful hope begin to grow. The column didn't last long. In the days after Detective Morrison left my kitchen, the world seemed to divide neatly into two columns: things I could control and things I had to trust to others. I kept doing the small work, photographs, photocopies, entries in the journal, while leaving the heavy lifting to Marcus, the bank, and the investigators. That division was its own kind of courage. It was Marcus who first told me they wanted to speak with Melissa face to face. He said it with the same careful steadiness he'd used before, as if arranging an errand rather than staging a drama. If we can get a controlled conversation on record, he said, we may get clarity sooner than we expect. He explained that law enforcement could lawfully record an interview during an investigation, and that what we most needed was an unambiguous statement about who had acted and why. He emphasized legality, no tricks, no entrapment. It felt right. It felt honest. Detective Morrison coordinated with the bank. Mr. Rodriguez agreed to place a formal request for identification and verification in writing if anyone attempted to present documents. The bank's own cameras, combined with the camera on my porch and the copies Marcus had, made a frame of evidence I hadn't thought possible when that first awkward envelope sat under the blotter. For months, my life had felt like soft paper folded and unfolded in the hands of others. Now it became a stack of records. The day they asked Melissa to come in, the air was thin and bright, the kind of Colorado morning where the mountains cut the sky into sharp pieces. I remember the light because it felt wrong for such a public thing to happen on a day so quietly beautiful. Marcus suggested I not be present in the interview. He said it might complicate things emotionally. Patricia drove me to the bank, and we sat in the car, folding our hands into our coats against a wind that seemed to know how to get under grief and into the marrow. Inside the bank, the room smelled faintly of lemon polish and printer toner. Mr. Rodriguez met us at the door, his face the same careful, professional neutrality he'd used on the phone. Detective Morrison was there in a plain suit, and a young officer sat by with a small recording device and a legal pad. Melissa arrived 15 minutes later, carrying a casserole dish and a disposable pan, as if she had been stopped on her way home from a visit. She greeted Patricia with a bright, practiced warmth, and hugged me awkwardly, as if hugging could smooth the lines of a problem that had been written in paper and not in human hands. They led her to a small meeting room.
Marcus and Detective Morrison sat opposite her. I stayed in the lobby with Patricia, my hands folded tight enough to feel the bone of them. Watching from afar made my heart move in a peculiar mixture of dread and a kind of parental protective pride. This was my life. I had called people to stand with me, and they had come. From the edge of the glass partition, I listened to the muffled sound of voices become a small, sharp film. The detective asked calm, practical questions. When did she last have access to Catherine's checks? Did she ever sign documents for Mrs. Patterson? Had she been to the bank with papers? Melissa's answers began the way they'd always been, careful, warm, the kind of language that disarms. I only ever wanted to help, she said at one point, her voice threaded with an almost theatrical concern. Mrs. Patterson is like a second mother to me. I only wanted to take some of the burden off. Marcus asked about the folder from the dinner, about the note found under the blotter in the study. Melissa's hands played with the edge of the casserole pan as if it steadied her. For a moment she held the line of kindness, then, in a way that made my stomach drop and my fingers unclench, her voice changed. It was a small phrase, a loosened seam. I didn't think it was a big deal, she said. I thought she would be okay with me helping. I thought she wanted me to. And then the sentence frayed into silence. Detective Morrison asked a direct question. Did you present any documents to the bank naming you as power of attorney? The pause was fun of the kind of weight that makes a person know they are about to be caught between story and fact. Melissa's eyes flicked to the detective, then away. She began, and then swallowed a noise that might have been a name or an excuse. I watched as if through fog. The bank's camera footage, which Marcus had made sure was being reviewed, had already shown a person presenting papers.
The signature on that paper matched the forgery we had photographed. The pieces were tightening into the shape Marcus had predicted. I felt both proud of the painstaking work we had done and ashamed that it had come to this. Shame was an odd companion to relief. Then Melissa did something small and human. She began to cry, quietly at first, and then with a sound stark and startling in the small room. "I just wanted to help with the bills," she said. "Everything got confusing, and I thought I could fix it." Her voice broke in a way that made the word confusing become an explanation and a plea. It is a terrifying thing to hear an admission that sits between regret and evasion, an admission that may or may not be a legal confession, but which still tilts the moral balance. Detective Morrison asked for more specifics, and the conversation moved into the kind of careful documentation that is not dramatic in the movies, but is decisive in a courtroom. He asked for dates, for names, for where she had been on certain afternoons. Melissa began to misremember details, then correct herself, and the corrections revealed gaps that law enforcement could follow. When he asked about a check that had been withdrawn and then deposited into an account she controlled, her silence spoke loud. At the end of the interview, the detective said, "Mrs. Patterson, based on the evidence and our review, I'm going to place you under arrest for forging a power of attorney and for identity theft." The words landed with a kind of clinical weight. They did not announce an understanding of motive. They announced that the law recognized a violation had likely occurred. The arrest itself was sober and professional. Melissa put down the casserole pan as if it had become heavier and walked with the officers. She looked back at me once, eyes red-rimmed and bewildered, and something in her face hardened in a way that left me feeling like I was watching the last frame of a film where people suddenly realized they were playing parts they'd been cast in long ago. I felt no satisfaction at that glance, only a profound sadness that a family had splintered so completely. When I left the bank, the sun felt too bright. Patricia drove me home in companionable silence, and the house's rooms, all those places George had once occupied and where small betrayals had been staged, seemed to breathe with a kind of legal air now, as if the furniture were witnesses willing to give testimony. The next weeks were a vortex of procedure. Melissa was booked and released on conditions pending arraignment. The district attorney's office received the materials Marcus and Detective Morrison had built: copies of the forged document, bank logs, camera footage, my journal, and the recorded interview where Melissa's story had slipped into admissions and uncertainty. A forensic accountant reviewed bank statements and identified a pattern of transactions that, taken together, showed repeated small transfers and unauthorized withdrawals across months. Little siphons that, added up, placed a significant portion of my estate at risk. Marcus let me know the number his team discussed, roughly in the neighborhood of $800,000 at stake in the sense of exposure and potential damage. He used the qualifier roughly because numbers in investigations tend to move like water. They shift under scrutiny and cross-examination. Still, the figure shocked me. It turned what had felt like the theft of a few loose bills into an actual architectural threat to a life planned with George. The DA filed charges. Melissa was arraigned, and the plea bargaining began, as it always does, cold, pragmatic, and more about legal leverage than moral reckoning. Marcus and I met with the victim witness coordinator to prepare my statement. "We will ask you if you'd like to read a victim impact statement at sentencing," she said. "Talk about what this has cost you, not only financially, but emotionally and in your relationships."
I found the request oddly useful. It gave me a shape to the pain, a place to write it down, and later to speak it out loud. There is a misconception people have about courtrooms. They imagine shouting, slam dunk drama, cinematic revelations. The truth is quieter. Hearings are procedural, with lawyers moving pieces across tables and judges parsing language like a seamstress reading thread. The plea hearing where Melissa admitted guilt to counts of forgery and fraud was less a moral reckoning than a legal consolidation. She accepted responsibility for the forgeries and for misusing my identity to access funds. The plea agreement included incarceration time, probation, and restitution. The judge imposed an 18-month sentence, 5 years of probation, and ordered restitution. Marcus and I both understood the restitution order as a moral declaration, more than a financial guarantee. The DA's office explained gently that full recovery is often unlikely in cases where assets have been dissipated. That possibility, that the money might never be fully returned, was a cold companion to the warmth of seeing the legal system acknowledge wrongdoing. In court, I read my victim impact statement. I had rewritten it several times, standing between indignation and restraint like someone balancing two plates. I wrote about the tangible things first: the papers that had been disturbed, the ledger entries gone missing, the bank holds, and the forensic reports that showed a string of small thefts. Then I wrote about the intangible, the loss of trust that is harder to quantify, the 2 years of sleep lost to counting shortages in my head, the afternoons I spent over the photographs of our study, trying to believe my own memory. When I stood to speak, the room felt both enormous and intimate in the same breath. I looked at Melissa in the dock and did not flinch. "I am not telling this story to hurt you," I said to the judge, the DA, and to the woman who had been my son's wife. "I am telling it to explain why I asked the law to stand with me. It is not for revenge that I came here, but to prevent others from being taken in the same way." I spoke of George and the way the house used to feel whole with his presence, and how the small, quiet acts of kindness had been misused. "I'm older now," I said, "but I am not helpless. I asked for help, and people came. That is what I want others to know." After the hearing, David came to sit with me in the hallway outside the courtroom. He had been through his own kind of grief, seeing the person he loved on the other side of an accusation, and then watching evidence tilt him toward a choice. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, and his eyes, so like George's, filled. He told me then that he had filed for divorce. He said he had started seeing a counselor. He told me haltingly that he was trying to understand how someone he lived with could build such a different life in private.
We talked about the practicalities, bank accounts, locks, the small, ongoing work of undoing what had been opened without permission. But in that hallway, more than the paperwork, we rebuilt something fragile, the pattern of talking honestly, and of sitting together long enough for trust to return. The sentence Melissa received did not heal everything. It did not knit the seams of family life back together. There were people in the neighborhood who looked at me with a curiosity that sometimes felt like pity and sometimes like respect. David and I began to organize small rituals, Sunday dinners where the conversation was safe and shallow at first, but grew deeper as the weeks turned. We learned to speak about Melissa without rancor, mostly, and to recognize that betrayal often ripples outward in ways that hurt many people, including those closest to the perpetrator. Restitution, the court said, would be ordered. Marcus cautioned me, as he had before, not to expect it as a windfall. He told me the money might be recovered in part, or may be subject to the limits of someone else's ability to pay. There was a clarity to that, however bitter. The legal outcome satisfied the need for accountability. It did not promise to patch every wound. The judge's sentence, the probation terms, the order for restitution, those were instruments of the state's privacy and authority, not a full repair of the intimate harm. Months later, as Melissa served time and then began a period of supervised release under probation, the house felt like a place of slow repair. I learned to watch for small betrayals in other forms, a call that arrived unannounced, a friend asking for something that seemed too convenient, a person hovering at the edges of kindness. I set healthier boundaries. No more signing without reading. No more allowing anyone access to checkbooks except in explicit, documented ways. Marcus helped me set up safeguards that felt respectful rather than disabling. They were practical measures: a trusted financial advisor assigned, monthly reviews of statements, dual signature requirements for large transfers. I say helped me because it never felt like an imposition. These actions were a way to continue living with independence while guarding against someone rewriting my life on shady paper. One of the most unexpected outcomes was the way the family began to mend. It was not a dramatic reunion. There was no sudden, scripted forgiveness scene. Instead, there were small truisms. David calling before visits, bringing coffee instead of staying over late, sitting with me in the living room and asking about George, not with the same hollowing curiosity, but with stories of his own memory. We went to therapy together once because the counselor suggested it, not to assign blame, but to learn how to talk about broken trust without barricades. Those sessions were clumsy at first. We did exercises that made us both uncomfortable.
But the discomfort, I found, was part of the work of becoming honest again. I think about why I chose prosecution. Some of my friends thought I might not want to press charges. They worried about the shape it would make of family dinners and holidays. But I realized prosecuting was a boundary as much as a punishment. I wanted the law to name what had happened clearly, to make a record that might protect others. It was not about anger alone. It was about refusing to make elders an easy target. I did not want predators to learn that a widow's grief is a map to privileges. In the months after the case, I began to use my small living room gatherings to talk gently about what had happened, not to gossip, but to explain how small things can add up. Patricia hosted a coffee morning at the church where women of my bridge club came and we talked about red flags. A loved one asking for unchecked access to accounts, set an insistence to sign documents, a pattern of small withdrawals that make someone say, "I'll handle that for you." The conversations were practical, and I took care not to sound like an alarmist. Notice, I told them, and document. Ask questions and keep a paper trail. Those were not instructions for legal behavior. They were the kinds of everyday habits that had helped me gather a case. I always said, talk to professionals, attorneys, bankers, trusted advisors, if you are unsure. People would ask me if I felt vindicated. Justice is a complicated word. The courtroom's verdict removed a part of the burden. It labeled the wrongdoing and gave it consequences, but it did not restore what was lost emotionally. The recipe for recovery, I found, was a long autumn of small acts, returning to hobbies, planting the roses George taught me to prune, hosting a Sunday lunch with neighbors who feel like family more than acquaintances. Those small acts of domestic continuity knit up the day-to-day fabric that crime had frayed. I also tried, in small ways, to think about Melissa as a person whose life had veered into a place that harmed many. I told myself that not every wrongdoing deserves nothing but scorn. Sometimes serious consequences paired with accountability can open a space for change. That thought felt fragile, but it kept me steady against the temptation to let anger be the only language I learned. The detective called occasionally to update me on probation checks and the DA's follow-up. Marcus handled the legal angles as they moved through the probation office. He was always careful to remind me that the loss processes are sometimes slow and imperfect. There were days I would feel impatient with the system, wishing for swifter remedies. Yet each time I considered impatient, I remembered that the slow, careful collection of facts, my list in the leather journal, the bank's hold, the camera's timestamp, had been the thing that made the system move at all.
One afternoon, months after sentencing, the probation officer called in a routine check and mentioned that restitution payments, where any had been possible, were being delayed by the logistics of asset liquidation. It was not surprising. Marcus had warned us. Still, the request in my chest to have everything restored in full persisted like a small, stubborn ache. I had to remind myself that the main victory had been prevention. The dangerous situation had been interrupted before more harm was done. That knowledge, practical, not poetic, helped. As I regained rhythm in ordinary days, I made an effort to be public with the story in measured ways. Patricia and I spoke at a local community center about elder scams, nothing legalistic, only the simple narratives that had helped me spot the pattern early, the way a person takes small steps, how help can be used as a wedge, and why documentation matters. I kept the focus on awareness and support. I always cautioned against fear-mongering. My point was simple. Predation thrives in silence and in the assumption that elders are passive. That assumption needed to be challenged. There were practicalities I had to reorder in my life. I closed one of our joint accounts and opened another that required dual signatures for larger transactions. I reworked my estate plans with Marcus present and clear. I named a trusted third party outside the family to help manage some administrative tasks, not because I wanted to be distanced, but because I wanted a buffer that prevented any single person from having unchecked control. These were choices that felt like both self-respect and sensible protection. Over time, the family gatherings regained warmth. David remarried eventually, but only after years of therapy and careful conversations about trust. The pain of what had happened did not evaporate like steam. It organized itself into a history we could speak about without the sharp edges it first had. Melissa's absence from our lives remained a quiet, complicated space, one neither full of malice nor entirely forgiven. People asked if I forgave her. Forgiveness, I found, is not a single act. It is a long season of deciding not to let bitterness be the engine of daily life. For me, that meant choosing to live in a house that smelled of roses and coffee rather than of suspicion. When strangers hear the headline, "They called her helpless," they sometimes picture an old woman fending off attackers with a broom. But my story is neither a crime thriller nor a tale of miracle strength. It is a record of attention,
of learning a new kind of courage that is patient and procedural. It is about calling good people to the door and letting them do the jobs they are trained to do. It is about refusing the narrative that aging equals incapacity. There were nights when I would sit at the kitchen table and look at the stack of documents that once threatened to unmake me.
I would run my finger along the crease of the journal where I'd written dates and amounts. The letters faded a little from being read so often. The sight of the stamped court papers and the camera stills became, in a strange way, a map of how to act when life tries to redraw your boundaries. The map is not glamorous. It is mostly patience, paperwork, and the humility to ask for help. I want to close with something practical, less as an instruction and more as a shared observation. A power of attorney is a legal document that allows one person to make decisions for another. It can be used for everyday convenience, such as paying bills or managing affairs if someone is ill. It can also be abused when someone signs or forges such a document without consent, which is when it becomes a tool for exploitation. Forgery is the act of falsifying another's signature. Identity theft is using another person's identifying information to gain access to accounts. These are legal terms that can sound abstract until they touch your life. Knowing what those words meant helped me translate my discomfort into action. There are patterns I learned to look out for. Again, not as commands, but as conversation starters with your family and advisors. Someone who insists on handling money without transparency, who pushes to isolate an elder from friends and documents, who asks repeatedly for unsigned papers to be signed or signed documents to be returned without copies. These behaviors are worth discussing openly with a trusted third party. If an account shows small repeated withdrawals or unfamiliar checks, trace them. If documents appear with signatures you don't recognize, get a professional opinion. But please, if you suspect something, talk to professionals, bankers, elder law attorneys, or law enforcement, so the response is legal and considered. If this story touched you, please share it with someone caring for an older loved one. Awareness can make a difference. There are national hotlines and local services that specialize in elder abuse and financial exploitation. Those organizations can offer guidance and support. I'm grateful to the people who helped me, Marcus, Detective Morrison, Mr. Rodriguez, Patricia, and to anyone who listens to stories like mine and chooses vigilance over silence. They called me Helpless when I was grieving. I let the name fall away by doing the work that grief sometimes makes difficult, keeping careful records, seeking professional advice, and asking for help. I called my lawyer, yes, but the real change came when a small community of professionals and friends answered the call with steady hands, and when I chose to turn my pain into a preservation of dignity for myself and others. If you know someone who might benefit from this story, pass it along. Tell them that being older doesn't mean being unprotected. It means we must be a little more deliberate about who we let into the room.
And if you are sitting with a quiet suspicion, write it down. Names and dates make a difference. They help facts become facts, and they help facts become action. I pruned the roses this morning, the same way George taught me, with patient cuts and a hopeful eye. As I worked, the house smelled like the small, ordinary life that is worth guarding. Coffee, earth, the salt of 100 remembered tears. I'm not helpless. I was strong in ways I didn't know I had, and stronger in ways I learned. And that is how I want the story to end. Not as a triumph over a single person, but as a quiet example that dignity, like a garden, needs tending and protection.